So I always, I shouldn't say always, but I sometimes get a question as to why for the midterm, after we've written 3 papers, more college, typical papers with analysis and quotations and MLA format and narrative and all these things, why write a letter for the midterm? It seems very old fashioned. And I do this all the time. I've done this in my one-on-one classes for over a decade now in one form or another, and there's a couple of reasons for it. I mean, I'm old, so when I was a kid and you'd have pen pals and you'd write letters to people. um uh, it also partially came about because over the years I've had colleagues and students who will send me things over email, and I'm not sure what they're asking me because there's no structure to the email. I'll have coworkers who send me things that I guess they're asking me to read something or to look at something, but they don't specify what it is they need me to do. So I thought to myself at some point, well, maybe if I showed people how to write a basic letter, that would be helpful in most job situations, because the kind of essays we write, you need to know how to do and need to have some skill in, obviously, for your other college classes. And depending on what your major is, you'll probably be writing a lot more of them. But in your daily life, you're going to be having more experiences and opportunities, work where you have to write memos and you may have to write other kinds of emails and letters. So it just seems like a good practical assignment. And as I mentioned in the last video, I also like it because it's a good way to pause here at the middle of the semester, work on something that's a little bit shorter than the other papers that we've done so far, and that also helps with a little prep for the second half of the semester. So in this video, I'm going to give you a screen share of the directions. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about the Sandra Cisneros, and not only how she relates to this assignment, because that was another inspiration for this assignment several years ago when I read this letter that she had written to Gwendolyn Brooks, one of her favorite poets, one of her heroes. It seemed like a good basis for an assignment. So I modified some previous kinds of assignments like this that I had, which is more detailed than you need to know in the background of this assignment, but just to give you some context. And I realized over the years, I was going through my stuff here at home, excuse me, today, and I have a lot of cool letters. I mean, I have a letter in here from Harlan Ellison, who's one of my favorite science fiction writers. He wrote it to me when I was in high school because I wrote to him asking for writing advice. And he wrote me back. He actually called me on the phone too and gave me a very good writing lesson. He swore at me a lot too because he didn't think I had very good thesis statements at that point in my life. I don't know if my thesis statements now are any better in my books or my articles, but definitely when I was 16 or 17, they weren't quite there yet. So he was very nice to send me a letter, and he sent me a book. I'll show it to you because you take a look at it with my name on it, and then the little note, and then the book to kind of teach me how to write a little bit better. I have a letter in here from Alan Moore that he sent me to school a couple of years ago when I was doing some research on some of his work. You might know him from, as I mentioned in the other video, from Watchmen. That's his graphic novel that was turned into a TV series. And the one that I thought was really cool, and I would have totally forgotten that I had this until I went through my bookshelves the other day, is I have a letter from Stan Lee. So for you Marvel fans out there, this is one that I got when I was in high school because I'd painted a giant mural of Marvel superheroes in our cafeteria. And the teacher that asked me to do it actually sent them photographs, and Stan Lee photographs. I guess their offices at that point were in Los Angeles from Marvel Entertainment. This is long before Marvel was what it is now. It was not a big multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar corporation owned by Disney. It was still pretty small at that point. And Stanley sent me this very nice letter that I'm sure he probably dictated to one of his assistants, but then signed. It certainly reads like he wrote it, but it's very kind of him. He just said that he liked the mural that I did. If I have any photos of that old mural, maybe I can show them to you. But anyway, this is it's old-fashioned writing letters, but in formal settings, it's a good skill to know how to do. So let me do a screen share here with you and give you some more suggestions on what to do for this midterm assignment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the second half too, although in this video I'm going to focus more on the first half. All right, so as always, read your directions, because the directions on this one really do lay out very specifically how to put the first half of the midterm together. And if you've read these directions, you'll know that please put the whole thing into one file. So there's 2 separate sections to this. Part 1 is the letter, and part 2 is the short response to the Jamila Woods poem. But just put them into the same Word doc or Google Doc. You don't have to separate them, and please don't send them separately because it gets a little confusing. Just put them into the same file. As I mentioned in the other video, this is an assignment that I often do as an in-class writing. when I have my normal, excuse me, in-class classes. And so we do it as an in-class writing, and I've sort of adapted it for these online at-home asynchronous classes. So how do you do this letter? Well, as I said in the last video, part of my reason for having you do this, aside from the links to the Cisneros essay, which I'll talk about in a minute, is also that it allows you to kind of reflect back on the first 3 papers that you wrote. So that's built into it, and it's sort of helping you not only think about them, but also to reread them, because I want you to go back through the essays that you've written, and I want you to pick one of those writers, as I said, that you could write to ask for writing advice. I mean, you could see where this also comes from. I just told you I wrote to Harlan Ellison, one of my favorite writers, when I was in high school, to see if he would give me some advice. And I guess the fact that he actually did take the time to write me back has stayed with me. So this is probably also where this assignment came from. So, you know, the letter is going to have 4 paragraphs, and I've given you a sample letter that I had to write a few years ago, which is on Blackboard. So that'll show you how to format it. So I'll talk about that in a separate video. The formatting is pretty simple. They are single spaced. There are gaps between the paragraphs, so they look a little different than a traditional paper. That's just how letters look. When I write a recommendation letter for any of you, for example, if you ask me for one, you know, they're going to be single spaced like that with the breaks between the paragraphs, because that's how I was taught to write a more formal letter. You'll notice they're more compact than writing a 3-page essay that's double spaced, because the expectation is that the person reading it is going to only want 1 or 2 pages that they're going to look at. So they're a little bit more compact, same way as you'd write if you were doing some kind of memo or report for work. So they look a little more compact than essays do. But in terms of the content of this one, you know, the introductory paragraph should just tell me some things about yourself. So again, you have to imagine that you're writing to this person. So let's say, for example, you decide to do this assignment and you're writing to Dwayne Johnson. Maybe you wrote a little bit about Dwayne Johnson in paper number 2, or I'll take it a better one. You all had to write about Mike Rose in paper number 1. So let's say you're writing to Mike Rose for this assignment. So in your first paragraph, you just have to tell him, introduce yourself to him. Who are you? What are you studying? What do you want to major in? If you don't know exactly what you want to major in yet, do you have some idea of what you want to focus on as you go forward in college? Do you want to, what certificate program are you in that you're finishing? What career are you looking forward to going into? That's all the basic stuff you put in the first letter. You know, you're introducing yourself to the person, right? So it is an introduction, but it doesn't exactly have a thesis the way that a traditional paper would. Although you should tell the person who is going to read the letter, in this case, if you were writing to Mike Rose, you know, why are you writing to them? So in this case, you'd say, well, I read one of your articles and I wanted to ask you some advice about my own writing. So that's all part of the first paragraph. And again, anything I'm mentioning now is already on these directions. I've kind of broken down the different paragraphs for you, because again, it is a little different than the other assignments that we've done. But then in your second paragraph, this is where you would do more self-reflection. So this is where you would say, okay, as I say here, now that you've had time to look back on this paper that you wrote and the comments that you wrote on it, what do you think of that paper? So talk about the essay that maybe you wrote about the person you're writing to. So let's say you wanted to write about Susan Sontag, or write to Susan Sontag and ask her for writing advice. Well, you could tell her what you said in your paper. Maybe you're writing to Alyssa Harad because you're looking back at paper number 3, and things maybe worked well in it, maybe other things didn't work as well, and so you're asking her for her writing advice. So your second paragraph of the letter is sort of a self-reflection, where you're going back, looking at the paper, one of these papers that you wrote, and commenting on it. You know, what worked in it, what didn't work, you know, what was effective about it. And you need to explain that to the person who's writing the letter. So again, let's say you were doing something on Evelyn Glennie, and you were going to explain to her how you did on your third paper for the class, where you wrote about her. Well, in your second paragraph, you could tell her about your paper. Say, oh, dear Evelyn Glennie, I've written this paper about you and some of your ideas. In it, I also wrote about one of my favorite songs, and here's how it went. That's the second paragraph, excuse me. And then the third paragraph, as I mentioned here, this is where you would say something about the writer themselves. So go back to their article. So let's keep the Glennie example going here for a second. Let's say that you've written your paper on Glennie for paper number 3. You've given an overview of it in the second paragraph, what worked, what didn't quite work, what you thought you could have done better. And then in your third paragraph of this letter, you would then explain to the writer, in this case, Evelyn Glennie, oh, Evelyn Glennie, I really liked how you described what it's like in hearing essay to be a drummer and how you use vibrations to be a performer, and how careful you are about hearing those vibrations, and then expressing these musical ideas to an audience. I really like the ideas you had on what does she call it, the fictional kinds of music and abstract kinds of music. So you want to take a quotation, right? And we know how to do that because you've done that for the first 3 papers. And then you would write down why you like that passage. What was it about this passage in Glennie that you liked, or if there's a particular section of her article you thought was really effective. So you can see where I'm headed with this, right? The second paragraph is talking about your one piece of writing that you did, what worked in it, what didn't quite work in it in this letter format. And then the third paragraph is then addressing what you thought worked really well in the person you were writing about for that particular article. Again, it could be Mike Rose if you want to go back and write about your first paper. It could be Susan Sontag if you're writing about the second paper. And again, if you want to talk about even Dwayne Johnson, we didn't really write about him directly, but you did have to read him for the Susan Sontag paper as a sort of supplementary reading, particularly with the way that he used family photographs in that essay. And then, as I said here in your closing paragraph, mention some things you'd like to improve in your writing in the second half of the term and ask for more advice on that. So given all the work that you did in the first half of the semester on those papers, what do you want to improve on? What was working and what wasn't working? So this first half really serves 2 purposes. Hopefully it's fun to do. It's a little more creative because you're sort of imagining that you're writing this letter to the person. You're reflecting on your own writing, and you're also reflecting on somebody else's writing and what makes it work. So the whole purpose of this first half is not only to get some practice in writing a more formal letter, but also in communicating these ideas in this format, and also reflecting on your own work, on your own writing. So that's part 1. Let me also show you here while I've got this open. I think I've got the details here from, oh, here it is. Okay, almost forgot that I had the Sandra Cisneros pieces open. I love using Cisneros for my classes, particularly because I have a lot of nostalgia for a lot of her writing and a lot of admiration for her as a writer, because in my first year composition English class, much like the one you're taking now with me, we read Sandra Cisneros. We read The House on Mango Street, which some of you may have read in high school. It's a short story collection. This was in the early 90s. So when I read it, it had only been out for a few years. Now it's considered a classic, but my professor had us read it for class, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite books in my first year composition class. I love the writing. I love her poetry too. It's really beautifully written. And now that I've lived in Chicago for over 15 years, I have an even deeper appreciation for her writing since I've lived in the city that she writes about so much for so long. So there's a selection of articles in here from her. Read those this week. We're going to work with her again in paper 4. So she's a bit of a preview for the 4th and the 5th papers that we'll do after the midterm. But for this assignment, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in this video, this was the letter that sort of inspired me to modify this assignment a few years ago. I read the book, read some of the essays in this collection that she has, and I saw this letter to Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks, again, was one of her favorite writers, classic, legendary Chicago poet, just amazing writer. I've got some links to her in Blackboard too. If you want to, you can see what her poetry looks like if you've never read it before. Gwendolyn Brooks is also a major influence on a lot of contemporary Chicago writers and musicians like Chance the Rapper and Jamila Woods, who you're reading for the second part of this. So she's a major, major, major figure. And so this letter that Sandra Cisneros wrote to Brooks, after she herself had already been a somewhat well-known writer, I thought was also fun. Now, again, it does have 4 paragraphs. They're structured differently than what I'm asking you to do, but I just wanted you to see what a sample letter like this would look like. In this case, she's writing to someone that she really admires. So it's a good insight into her writing. And again, it sort of inspired some of my thinking on this assignment. The other pieces in here are about her mom and her dad, and about her time in grammar school. And if you, like me and like her, went to a Catholic grammar school, you might have it may resonate with you a little bit if you read that article that's in here. But as I said, there's 4 different articles here from Cisneros. They're short, wonderfully written. So we're going to do a little bit more with her with the 4th paper, which is why I haven't given you a quiz on her yet, because this is kind of a preview, but again, she does tie in here with the midterm a little bit. So that's your reading for this week. Again, I hope you enjoy it. And, maybe as you read this letter to Gwendolyn Brooks, you'll get some ideas, even how to phrase ideas in your letter that you're writing. So to go back to the directions of the second part, of the midterm. And it doesn't matter what order you do them in. I mean, again, you have to turn them in at the same time to be in one document. But if you wanted to do the second part first, you could. It's really up to you, however you want to structure this. And as always, if you have any questions as you're working on this, please email me. I'm happy to look at a draft or give you some suggestions. Second part, again, is also a preview for paper number 4. So you can already tell what we're going to be doing in terms of looking at writers like Jamila Woods and Sandra Cisneros and some others in the 4th and 5th papers for the class. But this short response is one that I'm hoping you might even be able to use elements of in your actual 4th paper, because we are going to be writing a little bit more about Jamila Woods in that essay. And so here, again, very straightforward. You're going to write 2 paragraphs on this poem called Daddy Dozens, which you can click on. It'll take you right to the poem. You have to remember when you read this poem, it's written from her perspective as a little girl. So her dad is a doctor, and he's not home very often. I mean, he's home as much as he can be, but as a doctor, he's at the hospital quite a bit. And so she misses him a lot. And I've always gotten the impression that the way this is written, that what's happening is that she's on the playground with other kids when she's little, and maybe they're talking about what their parents do for a living, or they're asking her about her father specifically, and she starts playing the dozens, which basically just means that she starts trying to I don't know how to put it, she's like hyping up her dad. And if you don't know what the dozens is, a lot of rappers, for example, draw on the tradition of the dozens, which is it's a type of humor. It's a type of exaggerated humor that you've probably seen in movies before. It's part of the African-American literary tradition as well. This is a really funny poem, especially because, again, you have to remember, she's writing it from her perspective as a little girl who is very proud of her dad, is very impressed with him. So she'll say things about his forehead, how huge his forehead is, and how brilliant he is. Anyway, I don't want to spoil it, but you'll read it, and it's a really fun poem. It's got some real poignant parts too, because again, she's growing up and he's so busy. He's not always there with her, and so there's a little bit of a twist at the end of the poem as well, where there's a little more poignance to it, I guess. But anyway, you're going to be reading that, and as you take a look at the directions, once you read the poem, you can also listen to her reading the poem. And again, she's a musician as well, so she reads her poems wonderfully and really brings a lot of energy. And you can really hear more of the humor when you hear her reading them, particularly in the clip that I posted here where she's interacting with an audience. But I've given you some questions here too. So again, you're going to have at least 2 paragraphs here. Those paragraphs should have 6 to 7 sentences each. It doesn't have to be any longer than that, but I've given you some questions here where I ask you to reflect on the poem and give me your opinion on it. Now, with Jamila Woods, as with everything else that we've read, I don't want you looking up other interpretations of the poem. Don't try to look up other examples of what other people have written about her. There's not a lot of writing on her anyway, because she's a younger writer and has only been publishing and performing music for the last few years. But please don't start looking up other people's interpretations of this poem online. I'm not interested in reading other people's interpretations. I want to read your interpretation of the poem and what you got out of it. It doesn't have to be some expert Shakespearean analysis. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you get something out of reading this very wonderful contemporary Chicago poet. So you can kind of see again what's going to be going on with papers 4 and 5 as I'm getting into these contemporary Chicago writers, and we're going to be focusing more on them in the 4th and 5th paper. So at any rate, there's some details on the midterm for this week, my reasoning behind why I even give this assignment, and what I hope you also get out of it. In the next video, I'll talk a little bit more about Jamila Woods, and I'll even show you the structure for the letter. It's very basic. I'm sure you've written letters before for other classes, but I just want you to be aware of that structure so that you can write a formal letter someday if you need to. And who knows, maybe someday you'll get a letter from, whatever big comics or movie person that you're writing to. Like I said, I'm glad I found this old Stan Lee letter. I have a friend who's like, oh, maybe it's worth something. I'm like, well, it has nostalgic, sentimental value. I don't think it's probably worth any money, but it is something cool to have. And I'm glad I found this. I wouldn't have found it if I hadn't been looking for some examples for this assignment to show you. So if you have any questions on this midterm, please let me know. In the next video, I'll talk a little bit more about Jamila Woods and give you a little bit more of a preview of how we're going to use her writing, and also Gwendolyn Brooks and Sandra Cisneros for paper number 4 after the midterm. Okay, so please email me with any questions, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.